ended with yesterday. Okay, remember we had two things, okay, that we're looking to do when we simplify these. We are looking to either change everything to sine and cosine, or we're looking for trig functions squared and the number 1. Okay, if you notice here, I'm going to go ahead and convert everything to sine and cosine because I don't have a trig function squared in the number 1, or I don't have two trig functions squared. So if I change tangent to sine and cosine, what does tangent equal? Sine over cosine, good. Okay. Minus, all right, I've just got sine here times cosine squared. So really the only thing we switched was tangent. Okay. So what can I do now? Yep, cosines cancel. So really I have sine of theta minus sine of theta times cosine squared theta. So real quick, what do you notice about each of those terms? There's first term, here's second term. What do you notice?
They both have sine.
They both have sine. So let's take a sine out. So if I factor sine of theta out, what do I get here if I take sine from sine? I get 1. Okay, don't forget that 1. Gotta have the 1 there. Minus, what happens when you take sine from this?
Cosine.
Cosine squared. So yesterday, back in your notes, we have what 1 minus cosine squared equals. Okay? What does 1 minus cosine squared equal? We did that kind of on the side. Okay. Sine squared. Okay, that was, we kind of did that on the side of one of the problems because we needed a substitute in. So that's going to be one of those things, once again, too, that you might want to try and file away. So I have sine times sine squared. So real quick, let's just take a journey over here. If you had x times x squared, what would that equal? X cubed. So if I have sine times sine squared, that's going to be sine cubed, right? And there you go, you're done. So your whole goal is to take one of these big identities and to simplify it down. Okay, I'm going to warn you, this is the toughest one of the day. And this is the one that'll take up the most room. Okay, the other ones are a little easier. But this is the tough one.
They're basically the same thing.
Yeah, but not really. There's one difference.
That's the positive and negative.
Yep, that's a big difference. So now,
Not really.
I have two fractions, and I need to add the fractions together. So in order to add the fractions together, you have to have a common denominator. Good. So common denominator here is going to be 1 minus secant times 1 plus secant. Okay. So that means I've got to take this one times 1 plus secant
And that one times
and the other one times 1 minus secant. Now, if you're wondering why we haven't converted to sine and cosine yet, the reason is we're going to simplify with this first, and then when we get to the very end, that's when we'll turn it into sine and cosine. So now, I've got secant times 1 plus secant, so I'm going to distribute. And what does that give me? Yep, secant squared, good. Now this is actually a negative secant. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and change it to negative. And let's distribute that.
Where does the 1 go?
1 negative.
Because I took secant times 1 and then secant times secant. And so now I'm going to take negative secant times 1 and I get negative secant. And I'm going to take negative secant times negative secant, which is, okay, all divided by 1 minus secant times 1 plus secant. Okay, now on the numerator, what am I left with? Because if you notice, those cancel, right? So I
squared x
have secant squared x plus secant squared x. Let's think about this.
One dot cross option.
If I have x squared plus x squared,
It's
I would get 2x squared.
2 secant
Okay,
squared.
so in this case I get 2 secant squared. Now the denominator, we're going to go ahead and FOIL that out. Now one of the things about those terms, if you notice, first terms are the same, right? Last terms are the same. What about the signs between them? They're different, so we actually call these conjugates. And conjugates are special because you don't have to FOIL them all out. All you have to multiply are the first terms and the last terms. Okay, so with conjugates, all you have to multiply are the first terms, and you get what in this case? 1, and the last terms, minus secant squared x. Okay. Alrighty, next step. Ooh, boy. I see that I could turn everything to sine and cosine, but that could be kind of a pain because in the denominator here, that would be 1 over cosine squared. We'd have a fraction and a fraction, kind of a mess. So I also see that I have 1 minus secant squared. So I want you to go to your Pythagorean identities, those 3 that we wrote down. Okay? There should be a sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. There should be a 1 plus cotangent squared equals cosecant squared. Okay, and then there's 1 with 1 and secant squared. What is that 1 with 1 and secant squared?
Tangent squared plus 1.
Tangent squared plus 1 equals secant squared. So I need to somehow manipulate this one around so that I get 1 minus secant squared all on one side.
Tangent over on
Yep.
the other side.
Yep.
And secant over.
So let's move tangent over.
And then minus.
Yeah, and some of you might be able to do this in one step. I'm going to go ahead and do this in 2. But there's no reason why you couldn't do this in one step. Okay, and then you would do what? Put secant squared x on the other side. Good. So on the left side, you have 1 minus secant squared. What do you have on the right side? Negative tangent. So now, in place of 1 minus secant squared right here, I'm going to put negative tangent. Now there's 2 ways to kind of do this next step. I'm going to take the way that I think you'll understand the best. I can write this fraction bar as what? A division sign. Okay, and we kind of do that because it just makes dividing fractions a little bit easier. And the reason I did that is because now is when I'm actually going to turn everything into sine and cosine. What is secant squared equivalent to? Or actually, what is secant equivalent to?
1 over sine.
1 over cosine. Good job. Way to go. What is tangent equivalent to?
Sine over.
Sine over cosine. Nice job. So this is the thing. Notice how I've just attached the squares? You can do that. So I know secant is 1 over cosine, so secant squared is 1 over cosine squared. Tangent I know is sine over cosine, so tangent squared is sine squared over cosine squared. How do you divide fractions? Multiply by the reciprocal. So what's the reciprocal of negative sine over cosine?
Negative cosine over sine.
Negative cosine over sine. Ooh. So what happens? They cancel. And so if you notice, I have negative 1 times 2, which is negative 2. And notice I've got a sine squared in the denominator. So what trig function squared is the sine squared in the denominator? So which one is 1 over sine squared? What it?
Cosine.
Cosecant, yep. And so that is your final answer. Yeah, I told you that was the longest one. Okay.
I don't even remember where we started. I didn't get any of that.
So we'll go ahead and look at another one. Okay. So this was probably the toughest one because there were a lot of steps. So we're going to do a couple more today. And these won't take as long.
This is the 22 to 31.
Yeah, I think there are some of them, yeah.
So I did up to 16
Okay.
on that one.
8 problems. So now it says simplify. You have cosine over 1 plus sine plus 1 plus sine over cosine. So we're going to take the same path that we did in the previous problem. So what was the very first thing we did in the previous problem? Same denominator. So the
These can be canceled out.
no, they can't.
Yes, they can.
What are you going to multiply here? What are you going to
Times
cosine?
cosine.
Yep. What are you going to multiply the second one by?
times
1 plus sine, very good. Now this is the thing, come test time, if you're struggling with what to do, even just put the first step. I mean, if you don't know where to go after like the second or third, at least you've got it started correctly. So try something. So here I've got cosine times cosine, which I know is cosine squared. Okay? Plus, I'm going to go ahead and write this as 1 plus sine x times 1 plus sine x for right now. I'll FOIL it out in a little bit.
Wait, why is the sign on the bottom
It's 1 plus sine
of the
because you have to have a common denominator. And the common denominator in this case is cosine times 1 plus sine. Now, some people probably are going to want to FOIL, or not FOIL that out, but distribute that cosine. Don't. Leave it factored till the very end. All right, so let's FOIL out 1 plus sine times 1 plus sine. First term is what? 1. Outer term, sine. Inner term,
So,
last terms. Okay. So really, let's look at what we have. I have cosine squared in the top, plus 1, plus, what's sine plus sine? 2 sine x plus sine squared. Denominator is cosine times 1 plus sine.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we have to have the x's in there?
Yes.
Everything's so confusing.
Sorry. Okay, I want you to look at the numerator and see if there's something you can do.
Take out a cosine on the top. A sine.
I don't know if I take the sine out.
1.
What was one of the things, remember, one of the things that we said that we look for is changing everything to sine and cosine. I also look for a trig function squared in the number 1, or, which I have here, or I look for 2 trig functions squared. There was one thing I told you yesterday, never to forget. And I said, you don't ever forget this. Does anybody remember what that was?
I think I started.
And I highlighted it even.
Oh, sine squared plus cosine squared equals what?
So sine squared, which is what I have here, plus cosine squared equals 1. So basically, I'm now going to take both of those and I get 1. So I have 1 plus 2 sine x. But what is 1 plus 1?
2 plus
2 plus 2 sine x. Well, what good did that do me? Not much. Actually, it did us a lot of good. What do you notice about your numerator? They each have a 2. So let's take it out. So if I take a 2 out, 2 times what will give me the 2 that I have? 1. Okay, 2 times what gives me 2 sine x? 1 sine x, yep. Oh, what do you see happens? They cancel. It leaves me with 2 over cosine, which is really 2 times what? Secant. Okay, it's 2 over cosine, which is equivalent to 2 secant x. Okay. The last 2 types of problems are going to be on your homework as well, and it says write as an expression that does not involve a fraction. So basically, you don't want a fraction at all. Okay, got to get rid of that fraction somehow.
We can write as a percent.
I'll show you. Okay, what we're going to do here is we're going to multiply by the conjugate of the denominator. This is always what you're going to do. Okay, so the conjugate, remember, the first term stays the same. The last term stays the same. The sign between them is different. So what would the conjugate of 1 plus cosine x be? 1 minus cosine x. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and multiply both the top and the bottom by that. And the reason why we can do that is because really, we're just multiplying by 1. Because we could cancel those out, and that would give me 1. So on the top, I have 1 minus cosine x. On the bottom, with conjugates, remember we talked about the fact that all you have to do is multiply the first terms and the last terms. So what do I get when I multiply the first terms? 1. What do I get when I multiply the last terms? Negative cosine squared x. So what do you think goes in the denominator? What is 1 minus cosine squared equal? Oh, one of those ones, sine squared, good job. Because that was also one that we did yesterday kind of on the side. Okay, that's one of the trig functions squared in the number 1. So now what we can do, I'm going to show you this next step. It's going to look a little different. But what we're going to do is divide each of the terms by sine squared x. So basically I split the fraction up. Now why did I bother doing that? Actually, we're about done. That's, what is this? Cosecant. Cosecant squared. Okay, now this one, since that sine's there, if you have sine squared, that really means sine times sine. Because that's what sine squared means, just sine times itself. So let's think. You already told me that this equals what? What does that equal? Cotangent. And then look at this one. I've just got a sine floating in the bottom. So let's just put a 1 over that. So what would this be equivalent to? Cosecant. And there you go. We got one more to look at. Okay. Okay, these are going to take some time. It's going to take some time to get adjusted to thinking this way and to solving these types of problems. So, biggest thing is you just got to keep plugging through. So let's look at this one. What am I going to multiply by? What am I going to multiply by? Close. 1 plus sign. Remember, we'd use the opposite. So the top, let's just go ahead and leave that as cosine x, or cosine squared x, times 1 plus sine. The denominator, I need you to FOIL out the first and the last. And what do you get?
1 minus sine squared.
Oh, 1 minus sine squared. Because that's what, I mean, sine or cosine always has a function with it. What's cosine?
It's just there's no reason.
The bottom is what? You're right, the bottom is cosine squared because we know that 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. So now what ends up happening?
Can you cross those two off?
And what does that leave me with?
1 plus sine x?
And that's your answer. Because there's no denominator. Remember, it was to rewrite this so that there's no denominator. Okay, you've got 8 problems you need to add. Okay, here you go. 32, 34, 38, 39,
But we still have 20,
41.
31.
Yes, this is an add-on. Okay. So,